The air at the Black Hawk County Equipment Auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of late August dust, cheap cigar smoke, and the metallic tang of sun-baked iron. It was 1974, and the mood was electric. Corn was over $3 a bushel, beans were pushing $7, and farmers who'd spent their lives pinching pennies were suddenly walking around with checkbooks fat enough to choke a horse. I was there, leaning against the rusty fender of my '68 Ford F-250, mostly just watching the show. My name is Clarence Miller. My farm, the one my grandfather broke with a team of mules and my father tamed with a farm all was a modest 320 acres. It wasn't the biggest spread in the county, not by a long shot, but it was mine. Every last fence post, every square foot of topsoil was paid for. That was a distinction that mattered more to me than a fleet of new equipment. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Slim Perkins, whose voice could peel paint, was working the crowd into a frenzy over a 4-bottom Oliver plough that looked like it had been pulled from a riverbed. But that wasn't the main event. The real reason half the county was here was parked at the end of the row, dwarfing everything around it. It was a Steiger Bearcat Lucester, brand spanking new, its lurid green paint gleaming under the Iowa sun. It was an articulated 4-wheel drive monster, sitting on 8 massive tires that came up to my chest. The thing looked less like a tractor and more like a military vehicle designed to conquer a small country. The dealer had brought it out as a showpiece, a testament to the new era of farming. Go big or go home. And the man who wanted to go biggest was Dale Peterson. Dale was everything I wasn't. His father had sold out in the 60s, and Dale had come back after a few years at Iowa State with a business degree and a condescending smirk. He'd bought back his family's original quarter section, and, with the bank's eager help, had been gobbling up every parcel that came available ever since. He farmed 1,000 acres now, and he did it all on borrowed money. He saw debt as a tool, like a wrench or a welder. I saw it as a chain. Slim's voice hit a fever pitch as the bidding on the Steiger started. It was a straight-up duel between Dale and a farmer from the next county over. The numbers climbed past what a man could make in a decade, then 2. The air crackled. Men shook their heads, whistling low. Finally, the other farmer threw his hands up in surrender. "Sold!" Slim bellowed, his hammer cracking like a rifle shot. "To Mr. Dale Peterson for $62,000. A wave of murmurs and applause rippled through the crowd. Dale, standing near the auctioneer's block in a clean new pair of Wranglers and a seed corn cap, just nodded, a king accepting his crown. He strolled over to his new prize, running a hand over its enormous fender, as if it were the flank of a prize bull. That's when he saw me. He sauntered over, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. "Well, well, Miller. Come to see what a real tractor looks like?" I just took a slow sip from my lukewarm coffee. "It's a lot of machine, Dale. A lot of money, too." He laughed, a short, sharp bark that had no humor in it. "It's called an investment, Clarence. You got to spend money to make money, something you wouldn't understand, polishing up that old 2-cylinder junk your daddy left you." He was talking about my 4020, a 1969 John Deere, a side console diesel. It was the last tractor my father bought before the cancer took him. It had over 10,000 hours on it. The green paint on the hood was faded to a pale lime, and the seat was patched with duct tape. But every drop of fluid in it, every filter, every bearing, was meticulously maintained by my own 2 hands, and it was paid for. "That old junk put the crop in this year, and it'll do it again next year," I said, keeping my voice even. "And I'll sleep at night when it's parked in the shed." Dale's smirk widened. "You'll be sleeping while I'm planting an extra 160 acres before breakfast. This Steiger will run circles around you. And that pop-pop deer of yours. The bank knows it too. Mr. Henderson over at Merchants Trust, he told me himself. Dale, he said, you're the future of farming in this county. Men like Miller, they're a dying breed. He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be friendly, but felt like a branding iron. You ought to stop by the bank, Clarence. Get yourself a real line of credit. Join the 20th century before it leaves you behind in the dust. He walked away then, back to his monument of steel and debt, leaving me with the sour taste of his arrogance in my mouth. The crowd was already dispersing, the show being over. I watched him climb the ladder into the cab of that giant machine, the tinted glass reflecting the sky. He was the future, they all said, and I, with my paid for land and my old iron, was a relic, a dinosaur waiting for the meteor. Before we go any further, I have to ask you folks listening, do you remember a man like my father, or like me? A man who believed the only good iron was paid for iron, who saw a bank loan not as an opportunity, but as a yoke around his neck. Maybe it was your own father, or your grandfather, who taught you that a man's worth wasn't in the size of his operation, but in the smallness of his debt. Let me know down in the comments what you think. It's a question that defined a generation, and the answer to it would decide who was left standing when the music finally stopped. The following spring was a wet one. The rain came down in sheets through most of April, turning the fields into a thick, black gumbo. Every farmer in the county was on edge, pacing their farmhouses, staring out at the grey skies, the calendar pages turning with agonizing slowness. Every day you weren't in the field was a day of yield potential lost forever. When a window of dry weather finally broke in the first week of May, it was like a starter's pistol had fired. The roar of diesel engines filled the air from sunup to sundown, and leading the charge was Dale Peterson. You could hear his Steiger from 2 miles away, a deep, guttural roar that vibrated in your chest. He was pulling a 36-foot field cultivator, eating up his corn ground in massive, clean sweeps. He'd rigged up lights on the cab that could turn night into day, and he ran that machine 20 hours straight, stopping only for fuel. The talk at the co-op was all about him. "Did you see Dale?" one farmer would say, shaking his head in awe. "He'll be done planting by Friday. Took me 3 days just to get my little 80 done." "That's what horsepower gets you," another would add. "That's progress." I was making my own progress, just at a slower pace. My John Deere 4020, with its reliable 95 horsepower, was pulling a 16-foot disc, and then my 6-row 7000 planter. The synchro-range transmission whined its familiar song as I worked the fields, the smell of turned earth and diesel exhaust a perfume I'd known my whole life. I wasn't setting any speed records, but I was making steady headway. The ground was still a little tacky, and the 4020's jewels would slip and bite, the engine digging deep. I knew every groan and shudder of that machine. I knew the precise spot on the throttle where the 6-cylinder diesel found its sweet spot, that perfect hum of power and efficiency. I was about halfway through planting my corn when disaster struck. I was making a pass on the North 80, the field farthest from the house, when the tractor's hydraulics started acting up. The planter would lift sluggishly at the end of the row, then it wouldn't lift at all. I checked the fluid level. It was fine. But when I tried to raise the disc to turn around, the 3-point hitch barely moved. The steering got heavy, like wrestling a bear. I knew instantly what it was. The main hydraulic pump, buried deep in the guts of the tractor, had given up the ghost. A cold dread washed over me. This wasn't a simple fix. It wasn't a plugged filter or a loose wire. This was major surgery, and I was sitting in the middle of a muddy field with the best planting weather we'd seen in a month ticking away. Dale Peterson drove by on the gravel road in his shiny new Ford pickup, the Steiger already parked and clean back at his place. He slowed down, rolled down his window, and gave me that familiar, pitying smirk. "Having some trouble with that antique, Miller?" he called out. "Just taking a break," I lied, my face hot with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Right. Well, don't take too long. Looks like rain coming in tomorrow." He gunned his engine and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust that settled over my dead tractor like a shroud. It took me the rest of the afternoon just to get the 4020 back to the shop. I had to unhitch the planter, drive my old Farmall H all the way out there, and tow the deer home, a slow, humiliating procession. That night, the shop became my operating room. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long, dancing shadows as I started the teardown. The air grew thick with the smell of old grease and hot metal. First, I had to drain all 12 gallons of high-guard hydraulic fluid, a sticky amber river that seemed to take forever. Then came the real work. The pump was located behind the rock shaft housing, a heavy, awkward chunk of cast iron. I had to pull the seat, the cowling, the three-point hitch arms. Every bolt was tight, caked with 15 years of dirt and grime. My knuckles were raw and bleeding within the first hour. I used a cherry picker to lift the housing off, sweat stinging my eyes as I guided it clear. And there it was, the hydraulic pump, a complicated assembly of pistons and valves that was the heart of the tractor. I spent the next 2 hours carefully removing it, labeling each line and fitting with a piece of masking tape. By midnight, it was sitting on my workbench, its inside scored and ruined. The next morning, I was at the John Deere dealership before the parts manager had even finished his first cup of coffee. He was an old-timer named Gus who knew every tractor in the county. He whistled when he saw the pump. "She's shot, Clarence. Looks like the stroke control valve failed and sent metal shavings through the whole system. Can you rebuild it, Gus?" I could, but it'll take me a week to get the parts. And it'll cost you. A new pump is faster. Got one on the shelf, $800. $800. It was a staggering amount of money. It was more than my father had paid for his first tractor. But what choice did I have? Every hour the planter sat idle was money bleeding away. I wrote the check, my hand tight around the pen. The rest of the day was a frantic, greasy blur. I flushed the entire hydraulic system, cleaning out every line, every valve, every screen, trying to hunt down every last metal filing from the old pump's death throes. Then came the painstaking process of wrestling the new pump back into its place, torquing the bolts just right, reconnecting the lines. It was close to 10 o'clock that night when I finally poured the fresh high guard back in. I climbed into the seat, my body aching, my hands stained black with grease that wouldn't wash out for a week. I turned the key. The diesel engine coughed to life, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, as the new pump primed, I nudged the hydraulic lever. The three-point hitch arms rose, smooth and strong. I worked the steering wheel. It turned with one finger. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy washed over me. I hadn't been beaten. Not yet. The rain Dale had predicted never came. I finished my planting 3 days later, working under the pale glow of the headlights long after the sun had set. I had lost time and I had lost money, but I had done it myself. As I made my final pass, I saw the lights of Dale's house blazing on the hill across the valley. He was probably inside, sitting at his clean kitchen table, looking over profit projections from the bank. He had won the race to get the crop in. The whole county saw it. But as I shut down the 40/20 in the quiet of my own machine shed, the silence was filled not with the hum of debt, but with the deep, satisfying peace of self-reliance. It was a small victory, one no one else would ever see, but it was mine. The years that followed were a blur of golden harvests and soaring prices. The mid to late 70s were the boom times, the likes of which no one had ever seen. Russian grain deals, global demand, and rampant inflation sent commodity markets into the stratosphere. Corn hit $3.50, then $4. Soybeans went to $8, $9, then $10 a bushel. Land that had sold for $500 an acre in 1970 was suddenly being appraised at $2,000, then $3. It felt like the good times would never end. For men like Dale Peterson, it was a license to print money. With the success of his first big crop planted with the Steiger, the bank saw him as a golden boy. Mr. Henderson at Merchants Trust practically threw money at him. Dale leveraged his rapidly appreciating land to borrow more, to expand faster. He bought the 80 acres to my north, then the quarter section to my west. His operation swelled to over 2,000 acres. The Steiger was soon joined by a second one, a brand new Cougar thread. He built a massive machine shed that looked like an airplane hangar. He put up a new grain leg and a series of giant blue harvestor silos that became the new landmark for the entire township. His crowning achievement was a brand new combine, an international harvester, 1480 axial flow. It was a technological marvel, capable of harvesting 8 rows of corn at a time, its rotary design spitting clean grain into its massive hopper with incredible efficiency. When Dale drove that machine down the road, traffic pulled over to gawk. He was no longer just a farmer. He was the head of an agricultural empire. He was featured in the local paper, a full-page spread with a picture of him and his smiling family standing in front of the new combine. The headline read, "Dale Peterson, a vision for the future of farming." In the article, he talked about economies of scale, cash flow, and leveraging assets. He used words I barely understood. He painted a picture of a new kind of farmer, a businessman whose fields were his factory floor. He made a passing, condescending comment about some of his neighbors who were stuck in the past, unable to adapt to the new realities of the market. I didn't have to read between the lines to know who he was talking about. The community bought into it completely. At the diner, the men would talk about Dale's latest purchase with a kind of hushed reverence. He was the one who had figured it out. He was winning the game. And me? I was seen as a fool, a man standing on the train tracks as the express was bearing down. The high prices were good for me, too, of course. For the first time in my life, I had significant money in the bank. But my father's voice was a constant echo in my head, a voice shaped by the dust and poverty of the 1930s. "Son," he'd told me more times than I could count, "never mistake cash for wealth. Cash can disappear overnight. It's the land, paid for and clear, that lasts." So I didn't expand. I didn't leverage. I took the profits from those good years, and I did something that seemed utterly insane to everyone else. I paid off my debts. First, the small operating loan I took out each spring. Then, the last of the mortgage on the farm itself. One day in 1978, I walked into Merchants Trust Bank and handed Mr. Henderson a check for the final payment. He looked at the check, then at me, a strange expression on his face, a mix of confusion and pity. "Clarence," he said, leaning back in his big leather chair, "this is commendable. But are you sure this is the wisest use of your capital? With land values appreciating at this rate, you could use this as a down payment on the old Johnson place. Double your acreage overnight. Your net worth would skyrocket. My net worth feels just fine when I know I don't owe anyone a dime, I told him. He sighed, shaking his head slowly as he stamped my papers. Paid in full. You're a good man, Clarence, but you're missing the opportunity of a lifetime, a real lifetime. I walked out of that bank feeling 10 feet tall. The weight of that mortgage, a presence I had lived with my entire adult life, was gone. The farm was truly mine. But to the outside world, I had just committed an act of financial suicide. I had taken myself out of the game. Instead of a new tractor, I put a new steel roof on the barn. Instead of more land, I bought a small herd of Angus cattle, a tangible asset that would grow on grass and hay. I overhauled the engine on the 42 myself, putting in new sleeves, pistons and bearings, giving the old workhorse a new lease on life. I replaced the worn-out sickle on my old Gleaner E combine. I was shoring up my foundations while everyone else was building skyscrapers on sand. The contrast was never starker than one afternoon at the co-op. Dale was there, holding court by the feed sacks, a group of younger farmers hanging on his every word. He was talking about booking his grain on the futures market, about interest rate swaps, and something called a variable rate loan. The prime rate is ticking up, he said, with a confident wave of his hand, but Henderson locked me in on the new land for the first 2 years. By then corn will be $5 and it won't matter. You have to be aggressive. You can't be scared of debt. He glanced over and saw me picking up a bag of mineral for my cows. Isn't that right, Clarence? Or are you still saving up your egg money? The other farmers chuckled. I just nodded at him. Something like that, Dale. I loaded my bag into the back of my old Ford and drove home. That evening, I sat on the porch, listening to the crickets and the lowing of my new cattle in the pasture. On the radio in the kitchen, a newscaster was talking. It was just background noise, something about the Shah of Iran and rising oil prices. Then a name was mentioned that caught my ear. Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve. The announcer said he was promising to break the back of inflation, no matter what it took. A cold breeze rustled the leaves of the big oak tree in the yard. Across the valley, the lights on Dale Peterson's new silos blinked in the twilight, like the eyes of a giant sleeping beast. Everyone thought he was the smartest man in the county. But as I sat there on my paid-for porch, listening to the whispers on the radio, a knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I'd heard my father's stories of the Depression, of how fast a boom could turn to bust. The weather was changing, and I had a terrible feeling that a storm was coming that would wash away more than just the topsoil. The first sign of trouble wasn't a thunderclap, it was a whisper. It came in the winter of 1980, with the news of the grain embargo against the Soviet Union. At the co-op, the men who had been so bullish just a year before now stood around the heater stove with worried looks, their coffee cups growing cold in their hands. The bottom fell out of the market overnight. Corn that had been headed for $4 was suddenly struggling to stay above $2.50. Dale Peterson laughed it off. "It's a political stunt," he declared to anyone who would listen. "It'll blow over by spring. A savvy operator hedges his bets on the futures market anyway." He talked with the same unshakable confidence, but for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a tightness around the jaw. His cash flow, that river of money he was always talking about, depended on a constant, high-volume current. The embargo had just built a dam. The real trouble started that summer. A high-pressure system parked itself over the Midwest and refused to leave. The sky turned a hazy, bleached-out blue, and the sun beat down with a merciless intensity. The rain stopped. Day after day, we watched the corn leaves roll up tight like cigars, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. The ground once that rich, black loam, cracked open in fissures wide enough to lose a wrench in. The air was so dry it felt like you could strike a match on it. I spent my days cultivating, trying to keep a dust mulch on the surface to hold what little moisture was left. The old 4020 chugged along, its engine running hot but steady. I'd installed a new temperature gauge and kept a careful eye on it, cleaning the radiator screen every few hours. It was slow, tedious work, but it was all a man could do. My small herd of cattle was a blessing. They grazed the pasture down to the roots, but they were still gaining weight. They were a walking bank account, independent of the grain markets and the weather. Dale's operation, built for speed and scale, was ill-suited for a drought. His massive equipment compacted the dry soil, making it harder for the roots to find water. One afternoon, I was fixing a fence along the line between our properties, and I saw him stopped in the middle of his field. His big Steiger cougar was hooked to an enormous disc, kicking up a cloud of brown dust so thick it looked like the field was on fire. He wasn't conserving moisture. He was pulverizing what was left of his topsoil, sending it airborne to the next county. He was trying to solve a finesse problem with brute force, and it wasn't working. The harvest of 1980 was a disaster. Yields were cut in half. The corn that did grow had small, withered ears. For me, it was a painful but survivable blow. I didn't have a big crop to sell, but I didn't have big payments to make either. My cattle would eat the poor quality grain, and I would tighten my belt through the winter. For Dale, it was catastrophic. He had loan payments calculated on 200 bushel corn, and he was harvesting 90. The talk at the diner turned from awe to hushed speculation. People saw the lights on in his machine shed late into the night. Not the bright working lights, but the single bulb over the workbench. The breaking point came in October. I was combining my last field of soybeans, the old Gleaner E rattling and clattering along, when I saw it. Dale's magnificent International 1480 combine was sitting silent in the middle of his field, a thin wisp of blue smoke curling from its engine compartment. An hour later, the dealership's service truck was there. I saw Gus, the parts manager, at the hardware store a few days later. He looked tired. "What happened to Dale's combine?" I asked. Gus sighed and ran a greasy hand through his hair. "Turbo went out. Took the whole engine with it. The hydrostatic pump is shot, too. Looks like he ran it low on oil and cooked it." I whistled low. "That's a hefty bill." "Hefty doesn't begin to cover it," Gus said, lowering his voice. "We're talking $25,000 for a new engine and pump, plus labor. And we can't get a new engine till spring. The factory's back-ordered." "So, he's dead in the water." "Worse than that," Gus said, leaning closer. "He came in yesterday, wanted to put the repair bill on his line of credit with us. I had to tell him no. The front office put a freeze on his account. He's maxed out everywhere, Clarence. The bank is getting nervous." Dale ended up hiring a custom harvester to finish his beans, a final, humiliating expense. The great Dale Peterson, the man with the most modern equipment in the county, had to pay another man to bring in his crop because his own machine was a dead hunk of iron he couldn't afford to fix. The cracks in his empire were no longer whispers. They were gaping chasms, and the ground was starting to shake. That winter, the first foreclosure notice appeared in the legal section of the county paper. It wasn't Dale's land, but it was a neighbor of his, another young farmer who had expanded too fast. It was a tremor, a warning of the earthquake to come. The earthquake hit in 1981. Paul Volcker, true to his word, kept raising interest rates to fight inflation. The prime rate, the number that banks based all their loans on, began a terrifying climb. It went from 10% to 15%, then to 18%. By the summer, it peaked at a staggering 21.5%. For me, It was just a number on the nightly news. I had no variable rate loans. I had no debt. The bank couldn't touch me. But for Dale Peterson and thousands like him, it was a death sentence. His operating loans, his mortgages on all that new land, his equipment financing, it was all tied to that prime rate. The letters from Merchants Trust Bank started arriving weekly. His interest payments alone were more than what most men made in a year. The numbers were astronomical, impossible. The second blow was the collapse of land values. The same land that had been appraised at $3,000 an acre in 1979 was now struggling to find a buyer at $1,200. The foundation of Dale's empire, the collateral for all his loans, had turned to quicksand. He was suddenly upside down, owing far more than his assets were worth. The bank, which had been his greatest enabler, became his executioner. Mr. Henderson, the man who had praised Dale as the future of farming, was now a different person. His folksy charm was replaced with a cold, clinical professionalism. He was no longer a partner in Dale's success. He was a collector tasked with salvaging the bank's money. The end came swiftly. The foreclosure notices started appearing with Dale Peterson's name on them. First, the quarter section to my west, then the 80 to my north, then the home farm itself. The giant blue harvestor silos, once symbols of prosperity, now stood empty, monuments to a fallen king. His downfall was the talk of the county, a grim, cautionary tale told in hushed tones. I saw him one day at the gas station. He looked like a ghost. He had lost 30 pounds, his face was gaunt, and his eyes, once so full of arrogant fire, were hollow and haunted. He was driving an old, beat-up Chevy Love pickup. The shiny new Ford was gone. He saw me, and for a moment I thought he would turn away in shame, but he just gave me a tired, defeated nod. All the fight was gone out of him. "Clarence," he said, his voice raspy. "Dale," I replied. We stood there in an awkward silence, the pumps clicking away. "You were right," he finally choked out, looking at the ground. "All this time you were right. I built a house of cards on a windy day." I didn't know what to say. There was no victory in seeing a man so thoroughly broken. "I'm sorry for your troubles, Dale." He just shook his head and got in his truck, driving away without another word. My own life continued in its steady rhythm. I put the crop in with the 40/20. I harvested it with the old gleaner. I sold my calves in the fall for a decent price. I wasn't getting rich, but my farm was secure. My self-reliance was no longer a quirk, it was a shield. When a bearing went out on the combine, I didn't have to call a dealer. I drove to the parts store, paid $50 in cash for a new one, and spent the evening in my shop pressing it in myself. My survival depended on my skills and my paid-for iron, not on the whims of a banker in a downtown office. The community, which had once mocked my caution, now looked at me with a newfound respect. Men would stop by the farm, ostensibly to talk about the weather, but really to ask for advice. "How do you keep that old planter running so good?" one would ask. "Could you take a look at the carburetor on my Ford 8N?" another would say. I became a repository of old knowledge, of how to make do, of how to fix things yourself, of how to survive when the money ran out. I was no longer a dinosaur. I was a survivor, a living link to a past that suddenly held the keys to the future. The day of the Peterson farm auction was cold and grey, a miserable November Saturday that matched the mood of the crowd. The entire county was there, it seemed, not for the thrill of a bargain, but to witness a funeral. Dale's life's work was laid out in neat rows in his yard, each piece tagged with a number. The big Steiger and the crippled International combine sat near the front, their sheer size a testament to the scale of the ambition that had led to this day. They looked like beached whales, magnificent but helpless. Dale was there, standing with his wife and 2 young kids near the farmhouse. He looked thin and pale in a worn-out coat. His wife's face was tear-streaked. He wasn't the king of the county anymore. He was just a man watching his world get sold off, piece by painful piece. Mr. Henderson from the bank was there too, looking uncomfortable in his city shoes and overcoat, his face a grim mask. Slim Perkins, the same auctioneer who had sold Dale the Steiger all those years ago, was on the block, but his usual fast-talking banter was subdued, respectful. The smaller items went first. Tools, wagons, fuel tanks. The bidding was sluggish. No one had any money. Men were bidding with their heads down, as if ashamed to be picking over the bones of a neighbor's failed dream. Then came the big iron. The Steiger Cougar, the one that had roared across the landscape like a conqueror, was started up. Its big Cummins engine sputtered and coughed out a cloud of black smoke. It had been run hard and put away wet. The auctioneer started the bidding high, but the price fell, and fell, and fell. It finally sold for less than 1/3 of what Dale had paid for it, bought by a large corporate farm from out of state. It was hauled away on a lowboy trailer an hour later, a giant stripped of its dignity. The broken 1480 combine sold for little more than scrap value. The massive tillage equipment went for pennies on the dollar. It was a bloodbath. Then Slim Perkins moved on to the land. The parcels Dale had bought on credit were sold off first, going back to the bank for a fraction of their peak value. Finally, he came to the last piece. "All right, folks," he said, his voice quiet. "Next up is the original Peterson home quarter. 160 acres, with house and buildings. This was Dale's father's farm, and his grandfather's before him." A heavy silence fell over the crowd. This was the heart of it all. This was the legacy. Dale turned his face away, unable to watch. His wife buried her face in his shoulder. "What am I bid?" Slim asked. An opening bid was called out by the banker. Silence. Slim asked again. The banker bid against himself. It was clear the bank was just going to take it back. I had been standing at the back, just watching. I hadn't come to buy anything, but listening to Slim talk about Dale's grandfather, thinking of my own father and the sacrifices he'd made to keep our land free and clear, something shifted inside me. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. I raised my hand. "I'll bid," I said, my voice louder than I intended. Every head turned to look at me. The banker, Henderson, stared, his mouth slightly open. Dale looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Slim Perkins's eyes found mine. "I have a bid from Clarence Miller," the banker immediately countered. I bid again. We went back and forth, the numbers climbing slowly. It was all the cash I had saved during the good years, the money I'd kept in the bank instead of buying new equipment. It was the money Mr. Henderson had told me I was a fool not to leverage. The irony was so thick I could taste it. Finally, the banker shook his head and motioned to Slim. He was done. "Sold!" Slim's hammer cracked the cold air. "To Clarence Miller." I walked over to the clerk's table and wrote the check, my hand steady. When I was done, I walked over to Dale. He just stared at me, his face a mess of confusion, shame, and a flicker of something I couldn't name. "Why, Clarence?" he whispered. "After everything. Why?" "Because a man shouldn't have to watch his grandfather's legacy get sold on the courthouse steps," I said simply. "I'm not going to farm it. The land is yours to rent, for $1 a year. You farm it, you live in that house, you raise your family. When you get back on your feet, You can buy it back from me for exactly what I paid for it, not a penny more." For the first time that day, Dale Peterson cried. Not tears of failure, but of gratitude. He stuck out a trembling hand, and I shook it. It wasn't the handshake of a rival, but of a neighbor. Life settled into a new kind of normal after that. The farm crisis didn't end overnight, but the worst was over. Dale went to work at the local elevator during the day and farmed his home quarter in the evenings and on weekends. He didn't have a Steiger anymore. He bought an old International 806 and a 6-row planter at a farm sale. He was starting over, but this time he was doing it with his own sweat and cash, not the bank's. We never became close friends, but a quiet, profound respect grew between us. Sometimes I'd see him out in the field as I drove by, and we'd both raise a hand in a silent greeting. The years rolled on. My hair turned from brown to grey. My grandchildren came along, their laughter filling the old farmhouse. I kept farming, though I slowed down a bit. One sunny afternoon in the late 80s, my oldest grandson, Mark, who was about 12, was out in the shop with me. I was doing a tune-up on the old 40 to 20. It had over 15,000 hours on it by then, but the engine still purred like a kitten. "Grandpa," he asked, handing me a wrench, "why don't you get a new tractor? All my friends' dads have big new ones with air conditioning and a radio." I stopped what I was doing and wiped my hands on a rag. I pointed to the faded green hood. "Mark, this tractor here is more valuable than any of those new ones." He looked confused. "But it's old." "That's right," I said. "But it's ours. Every bolt, every wire, every tire. We don't owe a single penny on it. In the good years, it makes us a living. In the bad years, it doesn't break us. It doesn't come with a payment book that gets thicker when the rain stops falling. This tractor represents freedom. The freedom to make your own choices, to answer to no one but yourself and the good Lord above." I showed him how to set the timing, how to gap the injectors, the simple mechanical things a man could understand and fix with his own 2 hands. I was passing on more than just mechanical knowledge. I was passing on a philosophy, a lesson paid for by the hardships of my father's generation, and validated by the wreckage of my own. That evening, I sat on the porch swing, just as I had all those years ago. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. The lowing of my cattle drifted up from the pasture. Across the valley, I could see the lights on in the Peterson farmhouse. I saw Dale and his son out in the yard, working on their old International. He was teaching his boy, just as I was teaching mine. The giant machines and the towering silos that had once defined our landscape were mostly gone, replaced by a humbler, more resilient way of life. The future of farming, it turned out, wasn't about the size of your tractor or the scale of your debt. It was about the strength of your character, the depth of your roots, and the simple, enduring wisdom of knowing what was truly yours. The wind rustled the leaves in the old oak tree, and in the quiet of the Iowa twilight, I felt a deep and abiding peace. The storm had passed, and we were still standing.